All right, good morning once again. If you would open your Bible to the book of 1 Samuel. This morning we're going to be in chapter 28, verses 8 through 18. Chapter 28, 8 through 18. I know we're kind of stopping right in the middle of a story, but that's it's all I could get through in the time allotted to us. The title of the sermon this morning is The Danger of Deliberate Sin. The danger of deliberate sin. Let's read the text, open us in a word of prayer, and then we'll jump into the sermon this morning. 1 Samuel 28, beginning in verse 8, if you'll follow along in your copy of God's word. So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And he said, "Divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you." The woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death?" But Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." Then the woman said, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" He said, "Bring up Samuel for me." When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Samuel, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Do not be afraid. What do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I see a god coming up out of the earth." And he said to her, "What is his appearance?" And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe." And Saul knew that it was Samuel. And he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do." And Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this thing to you this day." We'll stop right there. If you will, pray with me. Lord, as we continue to make our way through this story of Saul, and as he continues to go deeper and deeper into his sin, God, I pray that you would cause us to go deeper and deeper into your grace. God, that you would help us to see that his story is not ours. By the miracle of the blood of Jesus Christ, by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit that you have graciously given us, that his story is not ours, that we don't have to live in sin. We don't have to continue in sin. We're not slaves of our sin. But I pray as well, Lord, that you would cause us to see this morning the danger of continuing to live in sin. The danger of sinning deliberately when we know to not do it. Help us to learn from Saul this morning, God. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Are ghosts real? It's a question that every kid has asked at one point or another. And many adults still ask today. Maybe you're this morning right now, we just read this text, maybe you're asking right now, wait a minute, are ghosts real? The sermon this morning is not about that. It's not about whether ghosts are real. Because a better question is this: is God real? Saul knew that God was real. He knew it. It just wasn't real to him. Which is why Saul had such a pattern in his life of deliberate sinning. That's what the sermon is about this morning. The danger of deliberate sin. If you're visiting with us this morning, we've been going through 1 Samuel, and we're in the middle of a story, right in the middle of a story. So let me give the context so we all are on the same page. Then I'll give exposition, and then I'll give application at the end, and then we'll take the Lord's Supper. So here's the context. Achish, who is the king of the Philistines, Achish and the Philistines have decided to go to war against Israel. When Saul sees their army, he is very much afraid. Now, normally in this situation, he would just consult with Samuel on what should he do. There's only one problem. Samuel has died. So Saul inquires of the Lord, but God will not answer him. So Saul decided to do something that he knew was wrong. He decides to consult a medium, or a witch, if you will. Saul had previously put all the mediums out of the land. But now he asks his men to find him a woman who is a medium. And they tell him, I know where one is. There's one in Endor. And that's where we left off last week. So let's pick up in our text in verse 8. We'll go through it verse by verse. 1 Samuel 28:8. So Saul disguised himself, put on other garments, and went, he and two of his men. They came to the woman by night, and he said, divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you. Now, it's unclear if Saul is disguising himself because he doesn't want the Philistines to see him. To go from Gilboa, that's where he's at. To go from Gilboa to Endor would bring him dangerously close to the Philistine army. It's unclear if that's why he's disguising himself, or is he disguising himself because he doesn't want any Israelites to see what he is doing. We don't know. Perhaps both. Maybe he doesn't want anybody to know what he's about to do. Saul and two of his men, they come to this woman by night, and he says to her, divine for me by a spirit. What does that mean? The word for divine is translated in other translations as conjure. And we know that word, conjure. To consult. It's normally translated as divination or diviners. If you remember Balaam, the false prophet Balaam practiced divination. Ironically, when Saul made an unlawful sacrifice earlier in this book, Samuel said to him, for rebellion is as the sin of divination. Now, Saul is guilty of both rebellion and divination. The word for spirit is the same word for medium. The Hebrew word for medium can be used to refer to the person who conjures, or it can be used for the spirit that is conjured. Saul says, bring up for me. What does that mean? In other words, bring up this spirit from the dead. Now, I want you to notice something. Saul believes that she can do this. He wholeheartedly believes that she can bring up this spirit from the dead. Look at verse 9. The woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death? Now, it's clear from the woman's statement that Saul did not remove his disguise. He kept his disguise on. So at some level, he did not want her to know who he was. She says, surely, literally, behold, you know what Saul has done. What an ironic statement. Yeah, he knew what Saul had done. He cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. And so she says, why then are you trying to lay a trap for my life to bring about my death? Now, I want you to notice three things about her statement. Number one, this woman knows her Torah. She knows that the punishment in the Torah is death. Number two, she assumes that Saul will uphold the Torah. She assumes that if she does this, Saul's going to put her to death. And number three, in saying this, she inadvertently gives Saul an out. This was Saul's opportunity to walk away. This was Saul's opportunity for him to say, oh yeah, I did do that a few years ago. Yeah, I shouldn't do this. Now, will he take this out? Look at verse 10. But Saul swore to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. What a tragic statement. Saul swore to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Now notice two things that Saul is doing here. Number one, he's breaking God's command. God had said to stone this woman. And instead of stoning, Saul is swearing to her that no stoning will happen. Number two, he is usurping the role of God As one commentator wrote, in fact, Saul's oath invoked the Lord to grant immunity to the one who broke the Lord's command. It turned God against himself. Such an oath was not only foolish, but was actually blasphemous. How can Saul say that no punishment will come to this woman? He's not God. What if God decides to put her to death? Look at verse 11 to 12. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Samuel, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. So previously Saul inquired of God, and God did not answer him. So he decides to inquire of Samuel. Now, what does Saul think Samuel's going to do? I mean, does he think God is on vacation and like Samuel's the next best thing? I rang up God. He didn't call. Who's next on the speed dial? Samuel. Notice what the narrator says here. When the woman saw Samuel. Now, how do we reconcile that with verse 3? Now, Samuel had died. How did she see Samuel if Samuel had died? Rabbinic interpretations include, number one, an actual raising of Samuel by the wicked means of necromancy. Number two, a deception perpetrated by the necromancer. Number three, God causing either Samuel or a demon to appear. Or number four, a demon acting apart from God to deceive Saul. Now, which of those four options should we take? I think they're all plausible except for number four. There are no demons who act apart from God. I think the first three are all plausible options. So which should we take? I'll give you my take. You can have a different take if you like. I'm inclined to let the text speak for itself. Let the text speak for itself. The text says she saw Samuel. So I think she saw Samuel. We know in the New Testament that God allowed Peter, James, and John to see both Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration. They were both dead. So I assume this is something similar where God allows this woman to see Samuel who is dead. When the woman sees Samuel, she cries out with a loud voice. Now, why did she cry out with a loud voice? Why does she do that? It's possible that all her other divinations were fake. It's possible she really was a con artist this whole time, but this time it was real, and it scared the mess out of her. Now, somehow, we are not told, the sight of Samuel, when she sees Samuel, somehow that told her that the person she was speaking with was Saul. Now, I don't know how, but she knows. And so she asked Saul, why have you deceived me? Now, it's interesting. She's considered a medium who can consult with the dead, but she didn't know this was King Saul. She's not much of a prophet, not much of a medium. Look at verse 13. The king said to her, do not be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a God coming up out of the earth. And this gets even stranger and stranger. Now, at this point, the woman assumes she is a dead woman. Notice, she assumes that she is dead. Why? Because she assumes Saul's going to fulfill the Torah. This is Saul. She thinks this is a trap. Like, oh my gosh, this is Saul. He's come here to trap me. He's about to put me to death. But Saul assures her, he says, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. You know what that's code for? Don't worry. I won't obey the Torah. And he asks her, what do you see? Now, it appears that Saul is unable to see Samuel. Only she can, for whatever reason. And the next phrase, most translations translate differently. Almost every translation translates this differently. The ESV says, I see a God. The Hebrew is Elohim, literally God. The NASB says, I see a divine being. The NIV 84 says, I see a spirit. The NIV 2011 has, I see a ghostly figure. King James, I saw gods. The Hebrew is plural. New King James, I saw a spirit. Net Bible, I have seen one like a God. CSB, I see a spirit form. Now, which of those is correct? I have no idea. I don't know. I suppose it would depend on whether you believe she actually was seeing Samuel or not, or some demonic form. I think there's two possibilities here. Just my take is that either she says God, because gods are often used to refer to demons. You see that with the sons of God and Job present themselves to could be angels, could be demons, fallen angels. That's one option. Another option is that Samuel was accompanied by angels with him. She saw both of them. Because again, it's plural. I see gods. I see spirit beings coming up out of the earth. You take it however you like. Verse 14, he said to her, "What is his appearance?" And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe." And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. Now, Saul wants to know if this woman is for real. You got to get the sense that maybe he's like, did you really see Samuel? What does he look like? What is his appearance? And she says, well, he's an old man, and he's wrapped in a robe. Well, that narrows it down dramatically. Now, somehow that told Saul that it was Samuel. I don't know how. Somehow that told him it was Samuel. Perhaps because Saul would remember Samuel's robe. Samuel previously told Saul, "The Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel." As Samuel turned to go away, Saul seized the skirt of his robe and it tore. And Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom out of Israel from you this day." As soon as Saul realizes it's Samuel, he bows with his face to the ground and he pays homage to him. Now consider the scene here. Here is Saul inquiring of the prophet of God. He is bowing with his face to the ground and paying homage to the prophet of God. How is Samuel going to respond to this? Look at verse 15. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me, what shall I do?" Now notice, the narrator describes this as who speaking? Samuel. Again, I think we should let the text speak for itself. The narrator says, then Samuel, not a demon, not a spirit, not an angel, not the woman. It says, then Samuel said to Saul. I think we should let the text speak for itself. I think Samuel is speaking to Saul here. And I love what Samuel says to him. "Why have you disturbed me?" So what do you do when a dead person speaks to you? I guess you speak back. Saul answered, "I am in great distress. The Philistines are against me. God has turned away from me. God answers me no more. Therefore, I have summoned you to tell me, what should I do?" Now notice what Saul is doing here. He is separating Samuel from God. He is acting as though Samuel would have some divine guidance apart from God. H.L. Ellison, a commentator, writes this: Saul, like not a few others, had to have guidance, not out of love for God, but for fear of making mistakes. That's a good quote. There are many of us who seek guidance from God, not because we love God, but because we're afraid of making mistakes. Samuel picks up on this, which is why he responds the way that he does. Look at verse 16 to 17. And Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, David." Samuel is saying to Saul, he says, look, if the Lord will not answer you, why have you turned to me? In other words, I don't have any counsel apart from God. I represent the Lord. And notice what Samuel calls the Lord in relation to Saul. Your enemy. That's terrifying. To have God as your enemy is terrifying. Samuel tells Saul, the Lord has done exactly as he said he would. God had spoken Saul's fate into existence. God said, this is your fate, Saul. He spoke it into existence, and Saul spent his life trying to make sure it didn't happen. Now, why did God do this? Why did God turn away from Saul? Why did God become Saul's enemy? Why did God tear the kingdom out of Saul's hand? Look at verse 18. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Now, Saul made many grave mistakes. We've looked at that over the course of this book. Saul made many grave mistakes, but where he really messed up was when God gave him a direct order. God said, now go and strike Amalek and devote them to destruction. All of them. Do not spare them. And Saul failed to obey. God had given Saul an opportunity to be an instrument of his wrath. Saul failed at that, and so rather than be an instrument of his wrath, he became a recipient of it. And we'll stop there with our exposition. Application. I have 7 exhortations for us. Number 1. There is a difference between unintentional, unplanned, and unassuming sin versus high-handed, presumptuous, and deliberate sinning. Let me say that again. There is a difference between unintentional, unplanned, and unassuming sin versus high-handed, presumptuous, and deliberate sinning. Now, let's be clear. All sin is sin. Let's be clear. Let's be very clear on that. Even the smallest little white lie falls short of the glory of God and deserves the full wrath of God. If all I ever did wrong in my life was I told one little white lie, that's all I ever did, I deserve the full wrath of God for all of eternity. So let's be clear. All sin is sin. However, we must be careful not to level the playing field so much that we act as though all sin is the same in exactly every sense, in every respect. We must be careful not to do that because that's not what the Bible teaches. That's not what the Bible teaches. Numbers 15:30 references high-handed sin. But the person who does anything with a high hand reviles the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from among his people. Psalm 19:13 references presumptuous sin. Keep back your servant also from presumptuous sins. Hebrews 10:26 references deliberate sinning. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. There is a difference between unintentional, unplanned, unassuming sin versus high-handed, presumptuous, and deliberate sinning. I say this, guys, because I hear this argument all the time. People say somebody is committing sexual immorality, and somebody makes an argument and says, well, what's the difference between that and me looking at pornography? They're different. They're different. Now, that's not to minimize this. This is grave too. You can deliberately look at pornography, but it's still different than deliberately committing sexual immorality. And this is different than the occasional lust, which is still sin. They're different. Saul knew that consulting this medium was wrong. He knew it was wrong. How do we know that? We know he knew it was wrong because he had previously put them out of the land. He knew that's what God had said to do. He put them out of the land, but he presumptuously, he deliberately, and with a high hand, he sought out this medium. He's even willing to risk his life to do it. He's got to come dangerously close to the Philistine front line to do this. That's how willing he is. His mind is set on doing this. He's committed to committing this egregious sin. Brothers and sisters, we all sin. Everyone in this room sins every single day, including myself. We all sin, but there is a unique danger of deliberate sinning. There's a unique danger when we just deliberately sin over and over and over again. 2, be sure your sin will find you out. Numbers 32:23. Be sure your sin will find you out. Numbers 32:23. On our recent trip to Alabama, I heard my wife's mother say to our boys, there's a Bible verse that says, your sin will find you out. Now, immediately I thought that was like just an old wives' tale or something. My first thought was like, is there really? I don't remember that in the Bible. When we got home, I asked my wife, and I was like, I didn't even look it up because I was so convinced it wasn't there. So I asked my wife with like tongue in cheek, I was like, hey, Lauren, where in the Bible does it say that your sin will find you out? And she immediately, without hesitating, says, it's in Numbers. I actually read it the other day. I was shocked. Numbers 32:23. Be sure your sin will find you out. Saul disguised himself and he went by night. He didn't want anybody to know what he was doing. That's why he goes by night. That's why he disguises himself. He doesn't want anybody to know what he's doing. When we are running from God or disobeying God, we all try to hide our sin, don't we? This is nothing new. It's as old as the beginning of time. Adam and Eve, when they sinned, what did they do? They immediately go hide in the bush. They hide. It's natural instinct. Cain did not confess his sin about his brother. He kills his brother, and the Lord's like, where's your brother? And he's like, I don't know. He knew where he was. Joseph's brother hid their sin from their father. They lied about it. Moses, after killing a man, he ran away to the desert for 40 years. Samson, when he ate forbidden honey, what did he do? He hid it from his parents. David hid his adultery and his murder from all of Israel. Ahab hid his sin of Naboth's murder, lied about it. Haman hid his wicked plan from the king. Jonah thought he could run away from his sin. Judas hid his sin of stealing money from the money bag. Now, I don't think they found this out until later. We were talking about this in a small group this past week. When they all sat around the table and Jesus said, one of you is going to betray me, none of you were like, it's probably Judas. They had no idea. Ananias and Sapphira thought they could hide their sin from the apostles. Peter tried to hide his sin of hypocrisy by withdrawing from the Gentile lunch table. And today, we are still trying to hide our sin. We are still trying to run away from it. But as Moses writes, be sure that your sin will find you out. When we are found out, it produces one of two paths. It can be the worst thing that ever happened to us, as in the case of Cain, Ahab, Haman, Judas, Ananias and Sapphira, and Saul. Or it can be the best thing that ever happened to us, as in the case of Moses, David, Jonah, and Peter. Listen to me, church family. It is far better to bring our sin into the light now than at the judgment throne. Whatever we're trying to hide, think about the logic of this. You don't actually hide anything. It'll all be disclosed on the day of judgment. It'll all be made known. God will bring it into the light. It's far better to bring it into the light now than on that day. 3, even if we are already walking down the path of sin, we can still, by God's grace, turn around. Even if we are already walking down the path of sin, we can still, by God's grace, turn around. Saul had inquired of God. God didn't answer. Now, at that point, at that juncture, Saul has a choice. He can wait on the Lord, or he can trust in his own plans. Saul takes the latter option. He decides to trust in his own plans. He asks his men to find a medium. They tell him, hey, there's one at Endor. Now, at that point, when they say that, he could still turn around. He's already sinned by desiring to meet him. Like, he doesn't sin when the moment he desired to meet him, he had sinned. He could still turn around, though. He doesn't have to go. He could go home at night and come back the next morning and say, you know what, guys? I shouldn't do this. But Saul decides to go. He disguises himself and he waits till night. He can still turn around. He's got his mustache. Oh, he probably already has a mustache. How do you disguise yourself? When you're a Jew, you already got a beard. He's got something on, some kind of disguise. He's taken the time to disguise himself. He's waited till the night. He can still turn around. He doesn't have to go. Now, once he gets to Endor and he sees the medium and he realizes, oh my gosh, she exists. There really is a medium in Israel that I didn't put out. He can still turn around. He doesn't have to do this. He doesn't have to consult her. But he decides to tell her, divine for me by a spirit. And then the woman gives him one last opportunity. She says, surely you know what Saul has done, how he cut off all the mediums, all the necromancers from the land. There's his opportunity. There's his last opportunity. He can still turn around at this point. It's not too late. He can turn around. He doesn't have to do this. But he goes all in. He goes all in. Brothers and sisters, even if we are already walking down the path of sin, we can still, by God's grace, turn around. 1 Corinthians 10:13 is one of my favorite verses in the New Testament. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with each temptation, He will provide a way of escape. Why? So that you may be able to endure it. Now, that way of escape, it's not a one and done. It's not a one and done. What do I mean by that? Sometimes it is. Let me be clear on that. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's not. What do I mean? Here's an example. Meaning we come up to a fork in the road. You come to a fork in the road where you have to make a decision. There is a path of righteousness and there is a path of sin. And when you come to that fork in the road, man, that path of sin is so tempting. And in that moment, at that fork, before we make a decision, God provides us a way of escape. That way of escape could come through a Bible verse, could come through an exhortation, could come through the Holy Spirit speaking to you, could come through circumstances, could come through a whale, could come through that way of escape. God provides a way of escape at that fork, but sometimes we don't take the way of escape. What do? We decide to walk down the path of sin. We get 1 mile down. You think, well, I already made my decision. I've already walked down this path. But it's not as if the moment we start walking down this path, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. No. It's not as if the moment we choose this path, we must see it through. We don't. We don't have to see it through. God often, not always, But often he provides ways of escape all along that path. All along it. And if we are in Christ, even if we're already walking down the path of sin, we can still, by God's grace, turn around. If we can turn around, it is never too late to turn around. Now, I've worded that very precisely. If we can turn around, it is never too late to turn around. 4, even Samuels are poor substitutes for Jesus. Even Samuels are poor substitutes for Jesus. Saul inquired of the Lord didn't answer him. So what did he do? Saul inquired of Samuel. I love Samuel's response. Why are you bothering me? Why have you disturbed me? I was just getting good at the harp in heaven. Why are you asking me? Samuel is essentially saying, what do you think that I can do for you? If the Lord will not answer you, what do you think I can do for you? Whenever God squeezes us, you ever been squeezed by God? Could be a job loss. You lose your job, God squeezes you. Could be a relationship loss. You break up, God squeezes you. Could be a loved one loss. You lose a loved one, God squeezes you. Could be dreams shattered. You ever had dreams, plans? God shattered them, totally changed your life. God squeezes you. We can easily be tempted to turn to substitutes. I talked about this last week. But let me make a point here. Substitutes are not always golden calves and mediums. Last week I said those substitutes are often golden calves. They're often mediums. Substitutes are often not golden calves and mediums. What Saul wanted was not a medium. What did he want? He wanted Samuel. But even Samuel says, why are you seeking me? I'm not a substitute for God. Even Samuels are poor substitutes for Jesus. The lost world turns to golden calves and mediums, but not Christians. If you're in Christ, you're not going to turn to a golden calf or a medium long term. Christians are tempted to turn to what? To Samuels. You say, what's a Samuel? Could be the church. Could be a pastor. Could be a discipler. Could be a Christian counselor. Could be a spouse. And make no mistake, those are all means of grace. Make no mistake, all of those are means of grace. Here's what they're not. They're not Jesus. They are not Jesus. Nothing can replace Jesus in our life. Nothing can replace the daily, personal, intimate walk with Jesus Christ. Nothing. Not me, not this church, not serving, not a Christian counselor, not a spouse, nothing can replace Jesus in your life. If you're turning to a Samuel, it's a poor substitute in your life. Only Jesus will do. Only Jesus. 5. Godliness is not measured by our distress levels, but our distress responses. Godliness is not measured by our distress levels, but our distress responses. When Samuel asked Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? What did Saul say? He said, I'm in great distress. Now, when we think of that, should we stone Saul for being in distress? Like, how dare you call yourself a Christian and be in distress? I don't think we can fault Saul for being in distress. It's understandable. There's an army knocking at his doorstep. David and 600 men have left Israel. Samuel has died, and the Lord won't answer Saul. It's understandable that Saul would be distressed. We're going to see in the coming weeks that even David was greatly distressed. 1 Samuel 36. David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him. Godliness is not measured by our distress levels, but our distress responses. Saul took his distress to a medium. David took his distress to the Lord. What did David do when he was in distress? 1 Samuel 36. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. 2 Samuel 22:7. In my distress, I called upon the Lord. Distress is a gift from God. It's a gift. It weakens our emotions and our minds, but it strengthens our spiritual legs. Number 6. If God is for us, who can be against us? If God is against us, who can be for us? If God is for us, who can be against us? If God is against us, who can be for us? Saul recognizes that God has turned away from me. Samuel confirms this. Samuel says, since the Lord has turned away from you and become your enemy. That is a terrifying statement. Terrifying. One of the most glorious statements in the Bible is Romans 8:31. If God is for us, who can be against us? In other words, if God is for you, Christian, if God is for you, let Satan and sin and the world and our flesh and the death and evil men, let them all be against us. Let the whole world be against us because God is for us. But the most terrifying thought is the inverse of Romans 8:31. If God is against us, who can be for us? On the judgment day, if God is against us, it will not matter who comes to our defense. It will not matter if your mom or your dad or your brothers or your sisters or your pastor or your discipler or the entire church community all come to our defense. There are no references in heaven. It's not going to matter. If God is our enemy, it will not matter who comes to our defense. And if God is our friend, it will not matter who comes to accuse. You can say whatever you like about me at the throne of judgment. If God is my friend, who can be against me? And I can write the most glaring, beautiful reference for you at the throne of judgment. And if God is against you, it's not going to matter. Seven, God's immutability is a glorious and devastating double-edged sword. God's immutability, that immutability means doesn't change. God's immutability is a glorious and devastating double-edged sword. Why did Saul seek out Samuel? Why did he seek out Samuel? I think Saul thought he would get a different answer. I think Saul thought that, well, I tried God. God didn't answer. Let me try Samuel. It's like if the boys come and ask me something, I don't answer them, and then they go ask mom. You know what Lauren says? Ask your father. I can't make a decision apart from your father. So Dad didn't answer. You got to wait for Dad. Samuel said to him, the Lord has done exactly as I prophesied. The Lord has torn the kingdom from your hand and has given it to your neighbor David. When Samuel gave this prophecy, he also said this. He said, the glory of Israel will not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind. This is a glorious and devastating double-edged sword, is it not? It means that when we die, God will not change his mind. 10,000 years into eternity, God will not change his mind. 100,000 years into eternity, God will not change his mind. That is devastating for people like Saul. Devastating. And it's glorious for people like Solomon, who was no more righteous than Saul. Solomon was no more righteous than Saul. But God had said about Solomon, my steadfast love will not depart from him as I took it from Saul. 2 Samuel 7:15. Everyone who places their faith in Jesus Christ has this banner hanging over their life. My steadfast love will not depart from you. Let's pray.